Let's talk about our relationship with China. Of course, we know it's been well reported the cover-up around the early outbreak of coronavirus in China. There's still a debate to be had about whether it was the wet markets that fermented this awful virus in the first place, but clearly a case to answer by China when it comes to coronavirus and its handling. Also concerned about the impact of Huawei providing our 5G technology and its impact on our potential national security. And then there is the small matter of a growing diplomatic row over Hong Kong. Is it time to redraw the boundaries in our relationship with China? An international cross-party alliance of legislators from 9 global parliaments has today announced to push governments to adopt a tougher stance on China. And one of the signatories to this alliance, I'm delighted to say, is Stephen Kinnock, Labour's Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Kinnock, welcome to Talk Radio.
Hello, good afternoon.
What are your concerns about China that have provoked this rather joined-up approach to dealing with this powerful nation?
So my concern is that the British government and other governments have been incredibly naive in the way that they've dealt with China over the last 10 years. You'll recall that David Cameron and George Osborne proclaimed this golden era where China was going to give British business access to their markets, and they were going to align with democratic norms and have free and fair trade. And none of that has happened. Our government rolled out the red carpet to Beijing and got very little in return. We were very naive and some might say negligent. So I think it's time to have that radical reset in our relationship with China. We need to be much more realistic about their agenda. They are setting themselves up as a systemic rival to democracy. Their authoritarian behavior in Hong Kong is completely unacceptable. They are breaching the international rule of law. There is clear evidence of a cover-up around coronavirus and the outbreak in Wuhan. And of course, they've incarcerated 1 million of the Uyghur people in the province there in a blatant violation of human rights. So we need a foreign policy which gets Britain off the fence and actually taking a position, because only by taking a position you can gain some respect and reset the relationship. And that's why I think this international parliamentary alliance is a good step in the right direction, because we can't do this stuff alone. We need to form an alliance of democracies to defend the values that we hold dear.
Now, you mentioned and reminded us of David Cameron's golden era relationship with China. Did we not benefit, though, from huge multi-billion pound investment in the UK as a result of that push?
Well, I'd say 2 things on that. One is we're still running a massive trade deficit with China. We have a £22 billion trade deficit. Sure. We buy twice as much from them as what we sell.
But of course, probably most nations do, because they produce everything, don't they?
Well, that is also a failing here. We've had no strategy abroad. We've also had no strategy at home. We've not had an industrial strategy which has built up our manufacturing sector and enabled us to make and export the goods that the Chinese want to buy. The Germans have done it. I mean, Germany has a much more healthy balance of trade with China. And in terms of investment coming in, I think we've also got to be clear about our national interests here. And when you look at the stakes that China are taking in things like Heathrow Airport, Thames Water, nuclear power, Huawei and 5G infrastructure, it feels to me like we're selling off the family silver. And that means that we end up with a strategic dependence on China, which also makes it more difficult for us to assert our political interests and values. Because China, these things come at a price. They have an expansionist strategy. And when you look at things like their Belt and Road Initiative, which is massive infrastructure investment around the world, in return for some of those investments, they expect political loyalty from those countries. And I think that's a very dangerous situation to get into.
Well, indeed. And I mean, you'll get no argument from me, given the fact that China is not a democracy. And we have conversations about America. And later in the show, Mr. Kinnock, we'll be talking about what sort of price we'll have to pay in terms of food standards and other other compromises to get a trade deal with the US. But at least the US is a democracy and a long-standing historic ally that shares our values. I mean, critics of America should think twice. Be careful what you wish for. At some point, the world's greatest economic superpower could be China, and China is a totalitarian regime. So be careful what you wish for.
Yes, I think we've seen the meteoric rise of China, and they are an economic superpower, but they do not share our democratic values and ideals. And I agree that whilst we might have serious reservations about the current administration in the United States, well, I'm certainly hoping and praying that there'll be a change in November. But the point is they have a democratic system where you can make a change. President Xi in China has basically been anointed as president for life, and he's taking an increasingly authoritarian line. And we see the crackdowns in Hong Kong. We see the surveillance state, the way in which free speech is completely suppressed in China. And I also think in terms of democracies, we need to look at creating an alliance of democracies in the Asia and Pacific region. You know, India is the world's largest democracy. Again, we may have some concerns about Modi in India, but nevertheless, it is a democratic country. South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Japan, really important countries. The UK needs a strategy, and what we have at the moment is a Conservative government that I'm afraid is just reacting to events rather than getting on the front foot and having a proactive strategy, and that needs to change.
Mr. Kinnock, there's probably not too much love lost between yourself and Donald Trump, but I wonder whether, therefore, you're sympathetic to his trade war with China.
Well, I think that we need to be much more realistic in the way that we trade with China. I think that they have stolen intellectual property. They do use their state-subsidized companies to dump their product on the market, pushing prices down. And so I think some of the measures that President Trump has taken in terms of getting a more balanced and level playing field in trade have been steps in the right direction. And I'm certainly no friend of Donald Trump. I criticize him across the board. But on China, I think that this is also bipartisan. I mean, the Democrats are coming forward with very similar proposals. So this and the IPAC that's been created, the International Parliamentary Alliance, is also very much a cross-party alliance. There's people from the right of centre and left of centre in that, and I think that's right. Managing the rise of China is the biggest geopolitical challenge that the world has faced for some time and will continue to face, and we need to be united in our approach.
And finally, with the clock against us, Mr. Kinnock, two more questions, if I may. Getting down to brass tacks, what specific moves would we like to see? For example, ought we to scrap the Huawei deal?
Yes, I think we need to phase it out, and that should be looking at a 22, 23 time horizon for phasing Huawei out of 5G completely. Other specific measures, we need a full international inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus and to the evidence that there appears to have been a cover-up. I genuinely hope that China would play an active part in that. But even if they don't, the G7 and other bodies should take that forward. And I also think we need to look at trade in the round and make sure that we get free and fair trade, and where necessary, strengthen our ability to stop hostile takeovers of companies. I'm very worried that coming off the back of this pandemic crisis, we'll have a lot of distressed British companies that could potentially be easy pickings for Chinese state-backed investment. And I think we need to urgently strengthen our defences in terms of preventing that from happening.
Well, in checking the power of this ruthless regime, you have our vote, Mr. Kinnock. One last one before we go. I don't think we've spoken since the election of Keir Starmer as leader of the opposition. On this show, we've been on record as saluting his calm, collaborative, collegiate approach. He seems to be very focused on the national interest. PMQs was a bit more spicy on Wednesday. The gloves were off. But in terms of your relationship with him and Labour altogether, do you feel you've got your party back?
I feel that we are now really united, strong and clear in our position, standing up for the national interest. we're a constructive opposition. Keir, as he pointed out, has written to the Prime Minister and offered to help on things like the schools reopening strategy. Those offers were ignored. So we do then, it's our patriotic duty to call the government out when it is not performing in the interests of the British people. I think Keir is doing an absolutely outstanding job on that. And I think we're seeing that when you look at Prime Minister's questions and you think, who do we want running the country? Well, there's only one answer to that question. It should be Keir Starmer.
Wonderful stuff. The biggest political names speak to Talk Radio. Thank you, Stephen Kinnock, for joining us, Labour's Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific, and one of the authors of an international cross-party alliance of legislators from 9 global parliaments. And it's all about checking the unstoppable, relentless power of China in our lives.